Seeing these helmets on the heads of white nationalists and Trump supporters was a bizarre and unsettling sight. It inspired me to write an article in Arena magazine, White Sculpture, White Race. It made me question, how did we get here?
10 o'clock Friday night, hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia, protesting plans to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. When marchgoers and counter-protesters clash again, hours before the Unite to Right march was even set to begin. Just after 10:30 a.m., the crowd growing in size. Local and state police in riot gear responding in force, but the violence escalating.
The scaffolding set up for the upcoming inauguration scaled. Windows broken, officers set upon by an angry and violent mob. Club sprayed with chemicals, punched and kicked. The crowd overwhelmed the police. What we didn't know then was how close they came to their targets. And soon he and his supporters began to deny the reality of what this was, calling it a peaceful protest, not an attempted insurrection. Cost lives. For others, their freedom. But getting to the truth will largely be determined by whether or not it costs Trump his political power. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
When I was at art school, I was curious why the painting and sculpture departments were separate, which led me to a lifelong exploration into the history of painted sculpture. But let's first talk about the Spartan helmet, popularized in modern culture through the film 300, directed by Zack Snyder and based on Frank Miller's graphic novel, has become a potent symbol of valor, strength, and defiance. 300, which dramatizes the Battle of Thermopylae, presents the Spartan warriors as hyper-masculine defenders of freedom against the invading Persian Empire. The imagery of the helmet, a sleek, bronze, faceless piece of armor, became iconic, representing an idealized vision of Western heroism and a glorified, often simplistic view of ancient Greek culture. The helmet's sharp lines, menacing eye slits, and overall design convey both anonymity and invulnerability, transforming wearers into symbols rather than individuals. In 300, the Spartan helmet serves as a visual shorthand for the Spartan's warrior ethos, a blend of discipline, fearlessness, and self-sacrifice. However, the film also emphasizes a stark, exaggerated dichotomy between the Greeks and Persians, often distorting historical nuances in favor of a binary narrative that pits West against East, Christian against Muslim. This polarizing depiction, though visually striking, contributes to the helmet's allure among modern extremist groups, who have co-opted its symbolism to project ideals of racial purity, nationalism, and white supremacy. I vividly recall neo-Nazi skinheads in Sydney in the 1990s wearing t-shirts with the threatening "Speak English or Die" emblazoned on them. The racism of that period towards anyone who wasn't white was brought to life in Jeffrey Wright's film Romper Stomper. The film portrays disturbing anti-Vietnamese tensions in Melbourne at the hands and boots of Russell Crowe's character, Hando. Among other things, Hando rails against being fed Italian food, calling it "wog food." So much for the Roman forebears of neo-Nazi ideology today. Today, neo-Nazis' use of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture seems to be ignorant of the fact that the sculpture they are appropriating depicted the very ethnicities they hate. When I first walked into art school, I was immediately struck by how the painting and sculpture departments seemed worlds apart, almost as if they were two different languages that weren't allowed to speak to each other. The painters were on one side, immersed in their canvases and colors, while the sculptors were on another, surrounded by stone, clay, and bronze. I couldn't understand why this divide existed. After all, art is meant to be a dialogue, a conversation across mediums that transcends boundaries. But here, these two worlds felt like they were forcibly kept apart, isolated from each other's influence. This separation felt strange, almost unnatural, and I couldn't help but question. Why were these forms of expression treated as distinct and unrelated? It was as if the vibrancy of painting had been stripped from sculpture, leaving only the cold, silent forms of white marble and bronze. It was here, amidst this imposed segregation of art forms, that my curiosity was sparked. I began to dig deeper, questioning why we had come to view sculpture as something static and monochrome, while painting was celebrated for its expressive, colorful narratives. That curiosity set me on a path that took me far beyond the walls of art school and into the rich, buried history of painted sculpture. I learned that ancient sculptors didn't see their work as static or colorless. They saw it as alive, dynamic, and richly adorned with pigments that brought their creations to life. The ancient Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians painted their sculptures with vibrant colors, celebrating the diversity of human skin tones, textures, and details. Statues of gods, heroes, and everyday people were once adorned with brilliant hues that told stories of identity, status, and culture. Stories that have been erased by time and the relentless whitewashing of art history. This discovery was a revelation. It opened my eyes to the profound loss of understanding that had occurred over centuries. The pristine whiteness we associate with classical sculpture today is a lie. A falsehood born out of Renaissance ideals, colonialism, and the subsequent racial ideologies that elevated white marble as a symbol of purity, beauty, and supremacy. Figures like Johann Joachim Winckelmann further solidified this myth in the 18th century, proclaiming that the whiter the body is, the more beautiful it is, ignoring the reality that the Apollo Belvedere and other sculptures were once covered in color. My journey became not just about reconnecting painting and sculpture, but about reclaiming the truth that had been lost and challenging the narratives that continue to shape how we view art and ourselves. I wanted to bring back the colors, the vibrancy, and the diverse stories that had been whitewashed from history. This exploration turned into an obsession, fueling my work and leading me to create the Finalism movement, a rebellion against the artistic conventions that sought to separate and sanitize these ancient, painted forms. Ultimately, my journey is about more than just art. It's about confronting the uncomfortable truths of our history, questioning why certain stories are erased while others are celebrated, and pushing back against the cultural forces that continue to dictate what is seen, remembered, and valued. It's about dismantling the false idols of white supremacy that have appropriated and twisted art to serve their narratives. And it's about reclaiming art as a space where the full spectrum of human experience can be seen, felt, and honored. When I started the art movement in 2005, it was an exciting time of rediscovering this lost art. Ancient Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians used vibrant colors to breathe life into their statues, portraying the ethnic diversity of their subjects. Yet, the whiteness of these sculptures has been co-opted by far-right groups as symbols of racial purity, completely missing the point. To understand the roots of this distortion, we must go back to the 15th century, to a man named Gomes de Zurara. He was a Portuguese biographer, writing about the life of Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the leading figures of the early transatlantic slave trade. In his writing, Zurara justified the enslavement of Africans, marking the first recorded use of racial categories to describe human difference. Zurara described black Africans as inferior to Europeans, shaping a narrative of racial hierarchy that would endure for centuries. It was this dehumanizing ideology that helped lay the groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade, a brutal system that reshaped the world and created the modern concept of race. The transatlantic slave trade, also known as the Atlantic slave trade, began in the early 15th century, when Portugal initiated the capture and transportation of enslaved Africans to Europe. It expanded significantly in the 16th century, when Spain and other European powers, such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established colonies in the Americas and required large-scale labor forces for agriculture, particularly for sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. The trade involved the forced movement of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, a journey infamously known as the Middle Passage, where many died due to brutal conditions. The slave trade reached its peak during the 18th century, with Britain being one of the dominant slave-trading nations, transporting hundreds of thousands of enslaved people annually. The trade continued until the early 19th century, when the abolitionist movement gained strength. Denmark was the first country to ban the slave trade in 1803, followed by Britain in 1807. Despite these legal bans, illegal trading persisted until Brazil, the last country to officially abolish the transatlantic slave trade, did so in 1888. By the time it ended, the transatlantic slave trade had forcibly removed an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans from their homelands, profoundly impacting African societies and leaving a lasting legacy of racial inequality and injustice across the Americas and Europe. Fast forward to today. Neo-Nazi groups, white supremacists, and far-right nationalists have hijacked the imagery of ancient sculptures to justify their twisted ideas of racial superiority. They point to these so-called white statues as proof of a pure Aryan race. But like Zurara, they're building on a lie. One of the most striking examples of this lost tradition is the statue of Augustus Prima Porta. Originally excavated in the 19th century, the sculpture was found painted in red and purple. Yet, for centuries, the notion of a white marble statue, stripped of its color, was held as the epitome of beauty. But it wasn't just painted statues that were erased from history. It was also the identities of the people they represented. Take, for example, Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211 CE. Severus was a North African, dark-skinned, and his busts were undoubtedly painted to reflect this. His mixed heritage and African roots challenged the modern perception of Rome as a purely European empire, showing the diversity of its leadership. Severus's death in 211 AD left a great legacy as a symbol of Roman expansion, military strength, and diversity within the empire's leadership. The question remains, the statues we see today are white. Was the paint simply lost to time, or was it deliberately erased to align with racial prejudices? It wasn't until modern archaeology uncovered painted statues that the truth began to resurface. And yet, even with this knowledge, the myth of the white classical ideal persists, especially in the hands of far-right groups who claim it as their own. I couldn't help but wonder, how could modern artists respond to this? What if we were to see the world's most famous artists today engage with these lost truths? That night, I had a dream. I saw Jeff Koons swimming next to an oil tanker with pool noodles, and we talked about art. Koons, an artist known for his glossy, larger-than-life works, which blend classical forms with a modern palette, seemed to offer a challenge to the sterile, whitewashed narrative of ancient art. But was he doing enough? In this dream, I challenged him to an art battle, not just to create with color, but to reclaim the deeper truth of painted sculpture, to confront the misuse of classical art in our contemporary world, and to join me in rethinking how art reflects identity and history. In 2023, I led an exhibition inspired by the article I wrote about Emperor Severus, highlighting this lost part of Roman history. The works I exhibited helped to reveal the true diversity of the Roman Empire, challenging the notion that it was a bastion of white power. Even in contemporary art, this dialogue continues. Artists like Yayoi Kusama and Jeff Koons have reintroduced color into their work, as seen in his sculpture, Apollo Cathara by Jeff Koons. This piece pays homage to the ancient Apollo of Cyrene, attempting to recreate the original's vibrancy, though the skin tones still lean toward the pale. Koons' work, while visually striking, still echoes a reluctance to fully embrace the reality of these ancient figures. As artists and historians uncover more about the polychromy of ancient sculptures, we see a more diverse world, one that challenges the white supremacist appropriation of art. And that's where the real irony lies. The far right's claim that these sculptures represent white purity is a complete fabrication. The truth is that ancient art, like ancient society, was a celebration of diversity. The whiteness that today's neo-Nazis worship is nothing more than the product of time and deliberate erasure. As an artist, my hope is that we continue to unearth these truths, that we challenge the whitewashing of history. Whether through exhibitions like Gods in Color, or by exploring modern painted sculpture, we can expose the absurdity of neo-Nazi claims and bring a more inclusive narrative to the forefront.
But at the end of the day, what art really is a vehicle of acceptance. First you accept yourself, and eventually the highest state is the acceptance of others.
It's the same.